Champagne tastes like chalk when you're standing alone in a wedding dress. Genevieve sat on the edge of a monstrous four-poster bed, listening to the carriage wheels crunch against the gravel below. Her new husband was leaving. He hadn't even bothered to remove his cravat. Most brides would weep. Genevieve just felt the agonizing itch of French lace eating into her collarbone, and a cold, creeping realization that the Duke of Westmore had made a terrible mistake. Not by marrying her, but by underestimating her. 40 pounds of silk, pearls, and imported tulle. That was what it took to buy a duke. Genevieve stood in the center of the master suite, the air around her perfectly still. The fire in the hearth was dying, reduced to sullen orange embers that smelled faintly of wet ash and old soot. Nathaniel had dismissed the maids an hour ago. "I want absolute privacy with my new duchess," he had said, his voice a smooth, practiced purr that had fooled the servants entirely. He had smiled at her, a tight, mechanical curving of the lips, and waited for the heavy oak door to click shut. Then, without a word, he had turned, picked up his riding crop, and walked out. Now, she was trapped in a cage of her own wealth. She reached behind her, fingers straining against the rigid boning of her corset. Her knuckles brushed the icy row of silk-covered buttons trailing down her spine. She twisted, her shoulders screaming in protest, and managed to undo the top three. The rest were unreachable. Panic, thin and metallic, tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She closed her eyes, forcing the rising tide of humiliation back down into her chest. She would not cry over this. She had known what Nathaniel was, a man drowning in the debts of his ancestors, desperate for the cash infusion her industrialist father, Harrison, could provide. She just hadn't expected the insult to be so immediate, so blatant. With a sharp exhale, Genevieve gripped the heavy fabric at her collar and pulled. The delicate French lace tore with a sickening rip. She didn't care. She yanked harder, tearing the bodice until she could wriggle her shoulders free. The dress hit the Persian rug with a heavy, muted thud, looking for all the world like a collapsed ghost. Genevieve stepped out of it, shivering in her thin linen chemise. She reached around and yanked the laces of her corset until the knot gave way. As the stiff whalebone loosened, she took her first real breath of the day. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the cloying, sweet stench of the white lilies her mother had insisted on placing in every corner. It smelled like a funeral. Genevieve walked barefoot to the towering window. The glass was freezing against her forehead. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, smearing the carriage lanterns into blurry yellow streaks as Nathaniel's coach disappeared down the long gravel driveway. He was going to her, Camille, the widow in the city with the sharp laugh and the townhouse Nathaniel paid for. Genevieve had known about her, of course. Gossip in high society wasn't whispered. It was served on silver platters. But knowing a thing and sitting alone in a freezing bedroom while your husband beds his mistress on your wedding night were two entirely different realities. She touched her collarbone. The lace had left raised, angry red welts across her skin. Her reactions felt disjointed. She wasn't heartbroken. Her heart was perfectly intact, beating a steady rhythmic pulse in her chest. What she felt was a deep, gnawing anger. Not the fiery, screaming kind, but a cold, heavy resentment. She had sold her youth, her freedom, and her father's fortune to a man who couldn't even offer her the courtesy of a performance. Her stomach growled. A harsh, deeply unromantic sound in the cavernous silence of the room. She hadn't eaten since dawn. Her mother had insisted brides must look fragile and fasting. Genevieve turned away from the window. She grabbed a heavy dark wool robe from an armchair, likely left behind by the previous duke, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint. She didn't need to cry. She needed to eat. The estate of Westmore was a sprawling, drafty beast of a house. The floorboards groaned under her bare feet as she descended the grand staircase. The marble felt like ice, sending sharp, biting shocks of cold up her calves. Shadows clung to the corners of the corridors, stretching out from the edges of her flickering candle. The house was silent, but it wasn't dead. It hummed with the settling of old timber, and the faint whistling of the wind squeezing through the poorly glazed windows. She found the kitchens in the bowels of the house. It was darker here, smelling strongly of dried herbs, old grease, and cold stone. The massive iron stoves were dark, but the residual heat made the room marginally warmer than upstairs. Genevieve set her candle on a scarred wooden prep table. She opened the heavy oak doors of the larder. Inside, the remnants of the wedding feast had been hastily shoved away. She bypassed the towering, untouched wedding cake. Sugar made her teeth ache right now, and pulled out a silver platter holding half a roasted pheasant. She didn't bother with a plate or a knife. She tore a piece of the cold meat away with her fingers and ate it standing there in the dark. The grease coated her lips, rich and savory. She found a heel of hard bread and bit into it, the crust scratching the roof of her mouth. She poured herself a tankard of cheap, bitter servant's ale from a ceramic jug on the counter. It was flat, but it washed the dryness from her throat. "You shouldn't be down here, Your Grace." Genevieve stopped mid-bite. She didn't jump. She merely turned her head slowly, swallowing the bread. A man stood in the doorway of the scullery. He was older, his face lined with deep, permanent grooves of exhaustion. He wore a rumpled waistcoat and held a lantern high. It was Elias, the estate manager. She had met him briefly during the negotiations. He had the eyes of a man who spent his life trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. He stared at her. Genevieve knew what she looked like. A duchess in a dead man's oversized robe, her hair falling out of its pins in a tangled, frizzy mess, eating cold pheasant with greasy fingers. She didn't apologize. She picked up a clean rag, wiped her hands, and took a slow sip of the flat ale. "Neither should you, Elias," she said, her voice steady. "It's nearly 2 a.m. "I was doing the rounds," he said, lowering the lantern slightly. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one worn boot to the other. His eyes darted upward toward the ceiling, as if calculating the distance to the master suite. "The Duke," he started, his voice faltering. "The Duke is currently unfastening the silk stockings of a French widow in Mayfair," Genevieve stated flatly. Elias choked on a breath. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He had urgent estate matters. "Please," Genevieve cut in, the words sharp enough to slice glass. "Let us not insult each other's intelligence. I know where he is. I don't care that he went. I care that he left me looking like a fool." She set the tankard down. The metal clinked loudly against the wood. "Tell me something, Elias. Are we completely ruined?" Elias blinked, caught off guard by the harsh pivot. "We're ruined, Your Grace. Your father's dowry—" "My father's dowry cleared the immediate debts to the crown," Genevieve interrupted, walking slowly around the table. The stone was freezing against her toes. "It repaired the roof. It stopped the foreclosure. But Nathaniel looked at me today like a man who was walking to the gallows, not a man who had just been saved." She stopped in front of the estate manager. She was shorter than him, but she didn't look up. She looked right through him. "Where is the rest of the money going?" Elias swallowed hard. The lantern trembled slightly in his grip, casting erratic shadows across his face. "I am not at liberty to discuss His Grace's private finances. His Grace is currently committing adultery on my dime," Genevieve said softly. "Give me the keys to his study." "I cannot do that. Elias." She stepped closer. She smelled the fear on him. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap wool. "Tomorrow morning, the bankers from London will expect the second transfer of funds from my family's accounts. My signature is required to release it. If I do not sign, this estate runs dry by Tuesday. The servants will leave, the roof will rot, and you will be out of a job. Give me the keys." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant patter of rain against the high, barred kitchen windows. Slowly, defeatedly, Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of iron keys. He placed them on the wooden table between them. "He will be furious," Elias whispered. "Let him be," Genevieve said, snatching the cold metal. "Anger is an emotion I can work with. Indifference is not." Nathaniel's study was suffocating. It smelled of spilled brandy, stale cigar smoke, and desperate masculinity. The walls were lined with dark, imposing mahogany bookshelves, packed with volumes that looked as though they had never been opened. The curtains were drawn tight, sealing out the night. Genevieve set her candle on the massive claw-footed desk. The leather surface was scarred and cluttered. She didn't hesitate. She used the smallest key on the ring to unlock the heavy-bottomed drawer. It stuck for a moment, the wood swollen from the dampness of the house, before giving way with a loud crack. She pulled out the leather-bound ledgers. They were heavy, smelling of old dust and binding glue. She sat down in Nathaniel's massive leather chair. It enveloped her, cold and stiff. She opened the first book. For the next 4 hours, the only sound in the room was the scratching of her pencil on scrap paper and the occasional harsh whisper of turning pages. The deeper she went, the colder she felt. The numbness in her toes crept up to her stomach. Nathaniel's handwriting was erratic, a chaotic scrawl of ink that spiked with panic the further back she looked. Her father's dowry had indeed paid off the visible debts, the tailors, the carriage makers, the butchers, the bank. But there was a secondary set of books, hidden columns, monthly payments bleeding out into an account listed only as TC. It wasn't Camille. The amounts were too staggering for a mistress. This was extortion. Thousands of pounds funneled out every quarter, keeping Nathaniel on a razor's edge of bankruptcy. He hadn't married Genevieve to save his estate. He had married her to keep himself out of prison. Or a grave. Her fingers were stained black with ink. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the gritty exhaustion settling behind them. The candle had burned down to a nub, drowning in its own wax. She looked toward the window. The heavy velvet curtains were glowing slightly at the edges. Dawn, gray, miserable, and wet. The heavy thud of the front door echoing through the quiet house made her freeze. Footsteps. Uneven. Heavy. They moved through the foyer, past the parlor, and stopped outside the study doors. The brass handle turned and the door swung open. Nathaniel stepped in. He looked terrible. The pristine arrogance he had worn at the altar was completely gone. His cravat was untied, hanging loosely around his neck. His fine tailcoat was damp with rain, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. He smelled strongly of gin, wet wool, and the cloying, powdery scent of cheap lavender perfume. He didn't see her at first. He walked toward the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a sloshing glass of amber liquid with a shaking hand. He threw it back, coughing slightly before turning around. He froze. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Genevieve. She was sitting perfectly still in his chair, the oversized robe dwarfing her, her hair a wild mane around her face. Her hands were folded neatly over his private ledgers. The shock on his face quickly morphed into dark, venomous anger. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he snapped, his voice rough. Genevieve didn't raise her voice. She didn't shrink into the chair. She simply looked at him, absorbing the sight of the pathetic, ruined man she had tied her life to. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly level. "I trust the widow was accommodating?" Nathaniel slammed his glass onto a side table. It shattered, sending shards of crystal scattering across the rug. "You forget your place, Genevieve. Get out of my chair and get out of my study." He marched toward the desk, looming over her, expecting her to flinch, expecting her to cry. She didn't move an inch. "Your study?" she asked softly. She picked up the heavy leather ledger and let it drop onto the desk with a loud, hollow smack. "From what I've read in the past 4 hours, Nathaniel, you don't own a single floorboard in this house. You don't own the chair I'm sitting in. You don't even own the boots on your feet." His face drained of color. The anger vanished, replaced by a sudden stark terror. His eyes darted to the open drawer, then back to the book. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "You miscalculated," Genevieve said, leaning forward. The smell of his stale gin washed over her, but she didn't turn away. "You thought you married a docile little purse. You thought I would sit upstairs and weep while you spent my father's money hiding your sins. You don't understand," he rasped, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I understand perfectly," she replied, tapping her ink-stained finger against the cover of the ledger. Who is TC, Nathaniel? And why do they hold a debt large enough to sink a warship? He stared at her, breathing heavily, trapped. The arrogant Duke was gone. In his place was just a desperate, frightened boy. Genevieve stood up. She pulled the robe tighter around her waist. "Sit down, Nathaniel," she ordered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You're going to tell me exactly who you owe, and then we're going to figure out how you are going to survive the next 6 months. Because if you think I am going to let you drag my family's name into the mud with you, you are sorely mistaken." Nathaniel looked at the chair, then up at his bride. For the first time since they had met, he truly saw her, and he realized with a cold shiver down his spine that he had handed the keys of his destruction to a woman who knew exactly how to turn the lock. The silence in the study was thick, tasting of old dust and impending ruin. Nathaniel collapsed into the heavy leather chair opposite the desk. He didn't sit like a duke. He folded inward like a punch drunk. He buried his face in his hands, his fingers dragging through his damp, ruined hair. Genevieve remained standing. She looked at the man who had promised her the world yesterday afternoon. His shoulders shook, but she felt no urge to cross the room, no instinct to place a comforting hand on his shoulder. Her pity had burned away hours ago, leaving only a cold, clinical curiosity. "Thomas Caldwell," Nathaniel whispered to the floor. His voice was scraped raw, catching on the syllables. Genevieve flipped to the back of the ledger, her ink-stained fingers sliding over the thick paper. She found the corresponding entries. "Caldwell, the shipping magnate in the East End?" Nathaniel let out a harsh, wet laugh. He dropped his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. "Magnate is a polite word for a vulture. He owns half the docks in the city. The other half he extorts. And how does a Duke of Westmore end up owing a dockside vulture 40,000 pounds? She asked. The number sounded absurd spoken aloud. It was the cost of an entire fleet. It was the cost of 10 estates. Nathaniel looked at the shattered crystal on the floor. He swallowed hard. 2 years ago, the estate was already bleeding. My father left nothing but gambling chits and gout. I tried to invest in the spice trade, ships sailing to the Indies. The returns were supposed to be astronomical. You bought shares, Genevieve stated. I bought a ship, Nathaniel corrected, his voice dropping to a shameful rasp. The Leviathan. I borrowed heavily from the London banks to finance the cargo, but the hull was rotten. She wasn't seaworthy. The harbor master refused to sign the launch papers. Genevieve stopped turning the pages. The ledger lay open, but she was no longer reading. She understood the mechanics of industry. Her father built foundries. He dealt in steel, sweat, and transport. She knew exactly what a desperate man did when a cargo was stalled. You forged the inspection papers, she said. It wasn't a question. Nathaniel flinched as if she had struck him. He squeezed his eyes shut. I paid a clerk to stamp them. Caldwell found out. He owned the clerk. He let the ship sail, knowing she would sink. And did she? Off the coast of Portugal, Nathaniel whispered. Taking the cargo and 22 men to the bottom of the Atlantic. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. Genevieve stared at him. She had expected gambling debts. She had expected mistresses, illegitimate children, perhaps even a blackmail scheme involving a stolen necklace. She had not expected 22 corpses. Her stomach roiled, a sudden violent surge of nausea that tasted like the grease of the pheasant she had eaten earlier. She gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her fingernails biting into the polished wood. Caldwell bought the debt from the bank, Nathaniel continued, his words rushing out now, a pathetic dam breaking. He bought the forged papers from the clerk. He came to me a week after the ship went down. Pay him double the loan in installments, or he takes the papers to the crown. I'd be stripped of the title. I'd hang Genevieve. Men swing for less than forgery and manslaughter. He looked up at her, his expression a grotesque mask of pleading. That's why I needed your father's dowry. It was the only way to keep the payments going, to keep me alive. Genevieve stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The rain continued to beat against the glass outside, an indifferent, rhythmic drumming. And last night? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Did Caldwell require you to visit a French widow on your wedding night to keep your neck out of the noose? Nathaniel flinched again. A flush of ugly, mottled red crept up his neck. Camille doesn't know anything about this. She's an escape. When I'm with her, I'm not a dead man walking. I just needed one last night to not think about the gallows. How wonderfully tragic for you, Genevieve said flatly. She walked around the desk. Nathaniel tensed, bracing himself, perhaps expecting a slap. She didn't touch him. She walked past him, moving to the heavy velvet curtains, and yanked them open. The gray, miserable light of dawn flooded the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the pathetic, rumpled state of the Duke. Here's what is going to happen, Nathaniel, Genevieve said, turning back to face him, the gray light framing her. You're going to go upstairs. You're going to wash the smell of cheap lavender and stale gin off your skin. You're going to put on a clean suit, and you're going to come down to the dining room at 8 o'clock precisely. We will have breakfast. The servants will see a tired but perfectly content newlywed couple. Genevieve, you don't— I am not finished, she snapped, the volume of her voice finally cracking like a whip. Nathaniel snapped his jaw shut. I am releasing the second payment from my father's accounts today, she said, pacing slowly back toward the desk. But it will not go to Caldwell. It will go to the estate. We are going to repair the tenant farms. We are going to fix the roads. We are going to make this land profitable again. If I don't pay Caldwell by the end of the month, he will ruin me, Nathaniel shouted, standing up, panic vibrating in his limbs. He will ruin you, Genevieve corrected softly. He will not ruin me. I will not allow my father's steel money to be poured into the pockets of a blackmailer to cover your cowardice. I will handle Mr. Caldwell. Nathaniel stared at her, utterly bewildered. You? You cannot deal with a man like him. He is a monster, Genevieve. He operates out of slaughterhouses and dockside taverns. He will chew you up. Genevieve closed the heavy ledger with a final, echoing thud. She picked up the ring of iron keys and dropped them into the deep pocket of the oversized robe. My father built his empire by breaking strikes and crushing iron, she said, walking toward the study door. She paused with her hand on the brass knob, not looking back. I was raised in the smoke of blast furnaces, Nathaniel. Do not mistake my silk dresses for a lack of spine. Be at the breakfast table at 8. Do not make me come looking for you. She stepped out into the freezing hallway, leaving the Duke alone with the shattered glass and the suffocating dawn. The dining room smelled of roasted coffee beans, salted butter, and damp wool. The fire in the massive hearth crackled, throwing frantic, nervous shadows across the long mahogany table. Genevieve sat at the head of the table. She had forced herself out of the oversized robe and into a stiff, high-collared day dress of dark green velvet. The fabric was heavy, pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Her maid had spent 40 minutes pinning her hair into an intricate, painful twist at the nape of her neck. Every hairpin felt like a tiny needle scraping against her scalp. She took a sip of her tea. It was bitter, steeped too long. The heavy oak doors groaned open. Nathaniel walked in. He had followed her instructions, though he looked entirely hollowed out. He wore a crisp navy tailcoat and a perfectly tied snowy cravat. His hair was brushed back, but the pallor of his skin was ghastly. He moved stiffly, like a man marching to a firing squad, and took his seat at the opposite end of the vast table. The distance between them was easily 20 feet, a barren expanse of polished wood and silver candelabras. A footman stepped forward from the shadows, placing a silver dome in front of Nathaniel. When the dome was lifted, a plate of coddled eggs and fried kidneys steamed in the chilly air. Nathaniel stared at the meat, his throat bobbing in a visible swallow. The hangover was clearly clawing at his insides. Genevieve picked up her silver knife and began spreading butter onto a slice of toasted bread. The scraping sound echoed sharply in the silent room. "Did you sleep well, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice carrying easily down the length of the table. It was bright, entirely devoid of the venom from the study hours earlier. Nathaniel blinked, startled by the performance. He glanced nervously at the footman, who stood rigidly against the wall, eyes fixed straight ahead. Yes? Very well. Thank you, my dear." Nathaniel managed, his voice raspy but steady enough. "I am so glad," Genevieve replied, taking a small, precise bite of her toast. The bread was like ash in her mouth, but she chewed steadily. "The rain makes for such heavy sleeping, doesn't it? Elias tells me the South Road is completely washed out." She was aware of the footman's subtle shift in posture. The servants were listening. They always listened. By noon, the entire house would know that the Duke and Duchess had shared a perfectly civil, mundane breakfast. The narrative of the abandoned bride would be fractured, replaced by the confusion of this placid domesticity. "Control the servants," her father had always said, "and you control the house." For 20 agonizing minutes, they ate in silence, punctuated only by the clinking of silver on porcelain and the crackle of the fire. Genevieve forced down half her toast and a slice of cold ham. She needed the energy. Adrenaline was a volatile fuel, and she could feel the edges of her exhaustion fraying. When Nathaniel finally pushed his plate away, the eggs untouched, Genevieve stood up. The footman rushed forward to pull her chair back. "I have instructed the stable master to prepare the closed carriage for 1 o'clock, she announced, smoothing the heavy velvet of her skirt. Nathaniel frowned, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "A carriage? To where? The roads are mud." "To the village," Genevieve said plainly. "We are going to visit the tenant farmers. The roof of the primary barn collapsed last month, I believe. We will assess the damage and assure them that repairs will begin immediately." Nathaniel stood up, gripping the edge of the table. "Genevieve, I cannot parade around the mud today. My head is splitting and I have correspondence to attend to." "Your correspondence can wait," she replied, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. She leveled a gaze at him, hard and flat. "We are newlyweds. The village expects to see their duke and his new bride. We will smile, we will shake dirty hands, and we will look entirely devoted to this land and to each other. Do you understand?" He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold finality in her eyes stopped him. He looked at the footman, who was steadfastly pretending not to hear the tension beneath the words. Nathaniel's shoulders slumped in defeat. 1 o'clock, he muttered, dropping the napkin onto his ruined breakfast. The carriage ride was a claustrophobic nightmare. The interior smelled heavily of damp leather and the pomade Nathaniel used in his hair. The suspension of the coach was terrible, throwing them against the tufted velvet seats, with every deep rut in the road. Genevieve sat as far away from him as the narrow bench would allow. She stared out the window at the bleak, rain-soaked countryside. The land was beautiful in a brutal, unforgiving way. Rolling hills of dark green, jagged gray rocks, and copses of skeletal trees gripping the soil. It was dying land choked by years of neglect. "Why are you doing this?" Nathaniel asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, masked by the rattling of the carriage wheels. Genevieve didn't turn her head. "Doing what?" This." He gestured vaguely to the carriage, to her, to the miserable day. "The charade, the village. If you hate me so much, why not pack your trunks and return to your father in London? You have the leverage. You could annul the marriage based on non-consummation. You could be free." Genevieve finally looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. "My father spent £500,000 to buy me a title. If I return home a ruined, untouched bride, I become the laughingstock of London society. My father's business rivals would smell blood. They would say Harrison's daughter couldn't even keep a bankrupt duke in her bed for one night." She leaned forward slightly, the leather creaking beneath her weight. "I don't hate you, Nathaniel. Hate requires passion. I pity you, but I will not let your pathetic choices dictate the rest of my life. I am a duchess now, and I am going to wring every ounce of value out of that title." Nathaniel swallowed, looking away, unable to hold her stare. The carriage violently jolted as they hit a particularly deep pothole, throwing their shoulders together. Nathaniel flinched away immediately, muttering an apology. Genevieve just smoothed her velvet skirt, her jaw set, counting the miles until she could begin her real work. 3 days later, the air in the East End of London smelled of raw sewage, burning coal, and rotting fish. It clung to the back of the throat, thick and gritty. Genevieve stepped out of the hired hackney cab. She had not taken the Westmore crest. She had slipped out of the townhouse where they were staying under the guise of wedding errands, wearing a heavy, unremarkable gray wool cloak over a simple dark blue walking dress. She kept the hood pulled up, shielding her face from the biting wind and the curious, hollow-eyed stares of the dockworkers. She told the driver to wait, handing him 2 silver crowns. He bit one, nodded, and pulled a heavy iron pipe from beneath his seat, resting it across his lap. This was not a neighborhood where fine carriages waited unmolested. The address Nathaniel had given her was not an office. It was a tavern called the Black Anchor, leaning precariously over the edge of the filthy Thames. The river slapped lazily against the rotting wooden pylons, thick with grease and discarded refuse. Genevieve pushed the heavy wooden door open. The hinges screamed in protest. The interior was dim, lit only by a few sputtering tallow candles that smelled heavily of animal fat. The floor was covered in sawdust that had long ago turned into a damp, dark mush of spilled ale, mud, and worse. A dozen men sat hunched over scarred tables. The low hum of gruff conversation died instantly the moment she stepped inside. She felt the weight of their stares. It was a heavy, predatory silence. She didn't shrink. She didn't clutch her cloak tighter. She walked straight to the long, sticky wooden bar. The barkeep was a massive man with a flattened nose and a dirty rag slung over his shoulder. He looked at her, his eyes drifting down to the fine leather of her boots peeking out from beneath the wool cloak. "You're lost, lady," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "I am exactly where I intend to be," Genevieve said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly in the quiet room. "I am here to see Thomas Caldwell." A few of the men at the tables shifted. A low, mocking chuckle rippled from a dark corner. The barkeep sneered, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Mr. Caldwell don't see strays. Go back to Mayfair before you lose your purse, or your throat." Genevieve didn't blink. She reached into the pocket of her cloak, her fingers brushing past the cold iron of her father's antique single-shot pistol, a comfort she had brought but prayed she wouldn't need to use. Instead, she pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. She tossed it onto the damp wood of the bar. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Tell Mr. Caldwell that the Duchess of Westmore is here to discuss a shipping manifest for a vessel called the Leviathan," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "Tell him I have 10,000 pounds in banknotes in this envelope, and tell him that if he makes me wait out here in this filth for more than 3 minutes, I am leaving with the money, and he can try his luck collecting it from the Crown's magistrates." The barkeep stared at the thick envelope. The wax seal bore the deep, unmistakable crest of the Westmore family. He looked from the seal to Genevieve's steady, unblinking eyes. The sneer slowly faded from his face, replaced by a wary hesitation. Without a word, he picked up the envelope, wiped his massive hand on his dirty apron, and disappeared through a low, unmarked door behind the bar. Genevieve stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her corset felt too tight, restricting her breathing. The smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. But she forced her face into a mask of bored impatience. She tapped her gloved finger rhythmically against the sticky bar, staring straight ahead at a row of chipped ceramic mugs. 2 minutes later, the door creaked open. The barkeep stepped out, holding the door open with his heavy shoulder. He jerked his head toward the dark hallway. "He'll see you." Genevieve picked up her skirts, ignoring the wet sawdust, and walked behind the bar. The hallway was narrow and smelled strongly of cheap tobacco and damp mold. She followed the barkeep to a heavy oak door at the end. He knocked once, pushed it open, and stepped aside. Genevieve walked in. The room was surprisingly clean, starkly contrasting the squalor of the tavern outside. It was sparsely furnished with a large, battered mahogany desk, a leather armchair, and a small coal stove burning quietly in the corner. Sitting behind the desk was Thomas Caldwell. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant. He was a small, wire-thin man with thinning gray hair plastered to his skull, a sharp pointed nose, and spectacles perched precariously on his face. He wore a neat, threadbare suit that smelled strongly of mothballs. But his eyes, pale, watery blue, and entirely devoid of warmth, gave him away. They were the eyes of a man who calculated human lives in shillings and pence. He was holding the wax-sealed envelope, balancing it on his fingertips. "Duchess," Caldwell said. His voice was incredibly soft, almost a whisper, yet it filled the small room entirely. I must admit I was expecting the Duke. I am unused to dealing with wives. Genevieve let the hood of her cloak fall back, revealing her pinned hair and the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. She walked to the desk, not bothering to wait for an invitation to sit. There were no other chairs anyway. "My husband is indisposed," Genevieve said smoothly. "He lacks the constitution for business. You and I, however, Mr. Caldwell, are going to renegotiate." Caldwell stopped balancing the envelope. He set it down gently on the desk. A slow, thin smile crept across his face, not reaching his dead, pale eyes. "Renegotiate?" he whispered, leaning forward slightly. "My dear Duchess, you are standing in an abattoir wearing silk and trying to haggle over the price of meat. You do not renegotiate a hanging offense. You pay it, or your husband swings." "Let us drop the theatrics," Genevieve said, placing her gloved hands flat on his desk. The wood was cold. "You are holding forged papers for a ship that sank 2 years ago. Yes, it's a hanging offense for Nathaniel, but it is also a felony for the man who extorts him. If this goes to the magistrates, Nathaniel dies, but you lose your leverage, your money, and likely your freedom when the Crown investigates how you acquired those papers in the first place." Caldwell's thin smile vanished. He sat back in his chair, the leather squeaking softly. "You have £40,000 left on the debt," Genevieve continued, her voice gaining momentum, cold and relentless. "I'm offering you $20,000 today, in cash. And in return, I want the forged manifest, the original loan documents, and the clerk's confession." Caldwell stared at her. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft popping of the coal in the small stove. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" he whispered. "If you refuse," Genevieve said, leaning in closer, so close she could smell the sour milk on his breath, "I walk out that door. I take my £20,000. I go back to Mayfair, and I hire the 3 best barristers in London to tie this case up in the High Courts for a decade. I will spend every penny of my father's steel fortune to ensure that by the time a judge even looks at those papers, you are ruined, investigated, and hounded out of this city." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her threat settle into the cramped room. "You deal in fear, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But I deal in steel, and I do not bleed easily. Take the $20,000, or take nothing." Thomas Caldwell did not blink. His pale, watery eyes remained fixed on Genevieve, searching the sharp planes of her face for a tremor, a tell, a sudden softening of resolve. He found none. She was a statue of dark wool and aristocratic ice, but beneath it, he could smell the same industrial soot that had built her father's empire. The silence in the cramped, mold-scented office stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The small coal stove in the corner hissed, a damp lump of fuel splitting open with a sudden crack. Caldwell leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning under his slight weight. He steepled his thin, ink-stained fingers beneath his chin. "$20,000, he repeated, the words tasting sour on his tongue. "You realize, Duchess, that you are robbing me of £20,000 of legitimate interest and capital." "I am robbing you of a fantasy, Mr. Caldwell," Genevieve replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. Her gloved hands rested flat against the chilled mahogany of his desk. Her palms were sweating profusely inside the kid leather, but her voice betrayed nothing. "The Duke is bankrupt. If you squeeze him for the full 40, he will break. He will flee to the continent, or he will put a pistol in his mouth. In either scenario, the Crown seizes the estate, the courts freeze his assets, and you are left standing in line with tailors and butchers holding a worthless piece of forged paper. You get nothing." She tapped her index finger once against the desk. A sharp, final sound. "I am offering you £20,000 today. Cash. You take a loss on your extortion, but you walk away rich and you walk away free." Caldwell stared at her. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his sallow skin. He was a predator who preyed on the weak, the desperate, and the foolish. Nathaniel had been all three. Genevieve was none of them. She was Harrison's daughter. She knew the math of survival. Slowly, agonizingly, Caldwell pulled a brass key from his waistcoat pocket. He unlocked a heavy iron strongbox sitting on the floor beside his desk. The lid squealed in protest. He reached inside and pulled out a thick folded sheaf of parchment. He placed it on the desk, keeping his hand pressed firmly over it. "The money," Caldwell whispered. Genevieve reached into the deep folds of her cloak and withdrew 2 more heavy wax-sealed envelopes. She placed them on the desk. Caldwell slid the parchment toward her, simultaneously pulling the envelopes across the mahogany. He tore open the seals with a dirty thumbnail, revealing thick stacks of Bank of England notes. He didn't count them all. He didn't need to. He thumbed the edges, checking the watermarks, his eyes narrowing with a greedy, feral satisfaction. Genevieve picked up the parchment. It was heavy, the edges yellowed and brittle. It smelled of old wax, damp cellars, and the metallic tang of fear. She unfolded it carefully. There it was. The manifest of the Leviathan. The list of cargo that never existed. And at the bottom, the bold, looping, desperate signature of Nathaniel right next to the forged stamp of the harbor master. Beneath it was a smaller piece of paper, the signed confession of the clerk Caldwell had bribed. Her stomach turned violently. She was holding the price of 22 human lives. She folded the papers and slid them into the inner pocket of her dress, right against her ribs, where the stiff boning of her corset pressed them into her skin. "A pleasure doing business with you, Duchess," Caldwell said, not looking up from the money. "Burn in hell, Mr. Caldwell," Genevieve said. She turned and walked out. The walk back through the tavern was a blur. The men at the tables stared, but the heavy predatory silence had changed. They saw the way she walked, back straight, strides long and purposeful. She had gone into the spider's web and walked out unbitten. They let her pass. When she stepped out into the biting East End wind, the cold air hit her face like a physical blow. She climbed into the waiting hackney cab, ignoring the driver's questioning grunt, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. "In Mayfair," she ordered, her voice finally cracking. As the carriage rattled away from the docks, the adrenaline that had been holding her spine rigid suddenly evaporated. Genevieve collapsed against the worn leather squabs. She pulled her gloves off with shaking hands. Her fingers were damp and trembling violently. She closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of old straw and horse sweat, trying to push down the rising tide of nausea. She had done it. She had bought her husband's life. But she felt no triumph. She felt completely, utterly contaminated. The paper pressed against her ribs felt like a physical rot spreading into her lungs. She had bargained with a monster, and in doing so, she had stepped into the very same mud that was drowning Nathaniel. The Mayfair townhouse was stifling. It smelled of beeswax polish, hot house lilies, and burning coal. It was a sterile, wealthy smell, entirely detached from the grim reality of the city outside its walls. Genevieve found Nathaniel in the drawing room. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting the room in a permanent, oppressive twilight. He was pacing the length of the Persian rug, a crystal glass of brandy clutched in his hand. He looked up sharply when she entered, his eyes wide and feverish, ringed with dark, bruised exhaustion. He stopped pacing. The ice in his glass clinked loudly in the quiet room. Genevieve didn't remove her cloak. She stood just inside the doorway, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind her. She looked at him. He was a handsome man, conventionally speaking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, thick dark hair, but stripped of his arrogance, hollowed out by fear, he just looked pathetic. "Well?" Nathaniel rasped. His voice was a dry croak. Genevieve reached into her bodice and pulled out the folded parchment. She didn't walk toward him. She walked to the massive marble fireplace, where a low coal fire burned behind an ornate brass grate. She held the papers up. Nathaniel dropped his glass. It shattered against the hearthstone, brandy splashing over the polished marble and soaking into the rug. He didn't notice. He stumbled forward, a raw, wretched noise escaping his throat, half sob, half laugh. "You got them," he breathed, reaching out with shaking hands. "My God, Genevieve, you got them." Genevieve stepped back, pulling the papers out of his reach. The sharp movement halted him in his tracks. "Don't touch them," she said, her voice dropping into a register he had never heard before. It was dead, completely devoid of inflection. Nathaniel blinked, confused, his hands suspended in the air between them. "What?" "Genevieve, give them to me. We need to destroy them." "I will destroy them," she said. "But first, you're going to look at them." She unfolded the manifest. She didn't look at his signature. She looked at the cargo list, at the tonnage, at the lies that had sent a rotten hull into a storm. 22 men, Nathaniel," she said, her voice cutting through the thick beeswax-scented air like a razor. 22 men drowned because you wanted to play at being a merchant." Nathaniel flinched, turning his head away, squeezing his eyes shut. "Please. I know. Good God. Do you think I don't see them every time I close my eyes? Please, just burn it." "You are going to look at me," Genevieve ordered. He didn't move. "Look at me," she shouted, the sudden volume shocking him into obedience. His bloodshot eyes snapped to hers. He was weeping now, silent tears tracking down his pale, aristocratic face. Genevieve felt no pity. The well was completely dry. "I paid £20,000 for this paper," she said, keeping her eyes locked onto his. "It is the last time my family's money will ever go toward your cowardice. Do you understand me? You're completely and utterly at my mercy now. I own this estate. I own this townhouse. I own your reputation." She turned to the fire. She knelt, ignoring the heat radiating against her face, and shoved the parchment deep into the glowing orange coals. The paper curled immediately, turning brown, then black, before erupting into a bright sudden flare of yellow flame. The wax seal melted, bubbling and hissing against the iron grate. It smelled strongly of sulfur and burning hair. Nathaniel collapsed into a nearby armchair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with violent, silent sobs of relief. The terror that had gripped him for 2 years was turning to ash in the grate, leaving him entirely hollowed out. Genevieve stood up. She brushed a speck of soot from her wool cloak. She watched the last corner of the paper turn red and flake away into nothing. "We leave for Westmore tomorrow morning," Genevieve said, turning her back on the fire. Nathaniel looked up, wiping his face with the back of his hand, smearing ash and tears across his cheek. "Tomorrow? But the season is just beginning. The parties—" "There will be no parties for you, Nathaniel," she interrupted smoothly. "You're going back to the country. You're going to sit in your study, and you're going to learn how crop rotation works. You're going to audit the tenant ledgers with Elias. You're going to become the Duke your father failed to be." He stared at her, bewildered. "And what will you be doing?" "I will be managing the accounts," Genevieve said, walking toward the door. "I will be rebuilding the foundries on the northern edge of the property. I will be making this family rich again." She paused with her hand on the brass doorknob. She didn't look back at him. "And one more thing," she said, her voice chilling the room. "You will never visit the widow in Mayfair again. If you require physical company, you will find it quietly, discreetly, with someone who does not cost this estate a single penny in rent or jewelry. If you embarrass me in public again, I will not need a forged manifest to destroy you. I will simply cut your allowance to nothing and let your creditors tear you to pieces in the street." She opened the door. "Genevieve," Nathaniel called out, his voice weak, trembling with a pathetic attempt at gratitude. "Thank you. I owe you my life." "You owe me a return on my investment, Nathaniel," Genevieve corrected coldly. "Nothing more." She stepped out into the hallway and closed the door, leaving him alone with the smell of burnt paper and the crushing weight of his salvation. 6 months later, the ballroom of the Duke of Arlington's London estate was a suffocating nightmare of imported orchids, heavy French perfumes, and the sharp tang of aristocratic sweat. The crystal chandeliers overhead blazed with hundreds of beeswax candles, casting a blinding, glittering light over the swirling sea of silk and broadcloth. Genevieve stood near one of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, slightly removed from the crush of the dancers. The cool night air pressing against the glass behind her was a small mercy against the stifling heat of the room. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue velvet. It was unadorned by lace or ribbons, relying entirely on the severe architectural cut of the bodice and the sheer weight of the fabric to command attention. Around her neck sat a heavy collar of square-cut sapphires, not a Westmore heirloom, but a purchase she had made herself, with the profits from the newly reopened northern coal mines. She took a sip of her champagne. It was dry and crisp. It no longer tasted like chalk. A few feet away, Nathaniel was caught in conversation with a group of elderly lords. He looked significantly healthier than he had on their wedding night. The bruised exhaustion under his eyes had faded, replaced by a permanent, quiet resignation. He wore a perfectly tailored black tailcoat, playing the part of the attentive, reformed nobleman. He nodded at whatever Lord Hastings was saying, but his eyes kept darting back to Genevieve, checking her expression, anchoring himself to her approval. He was broken, perfectly trained to the bit. "A striking gown, Your Grace." Genevieve turned her head slowly. Standing beside her was a woman in a dress of pale, scandalous pink silk that clung to her curves in a way that defied the rigid fashion of the season. She had dark hair piled high, heavily rouged cheeks, and eyes that were sharp, dark, and calculating. Camille, the widow from Mayfair. Genevieve had never met her, but she knew the face from the sketches she had hired an inquiry agent to make months ago. Genevieve didn't flinch. She didn't spill her champagne. She merely looked the woman up and down, a slow, clinical appraisal that made the widow's confident smile falter slightly. "Madame," Genevieve acknowledged, her voice polite, cool, and entirely unbothered. Camille snapped her fan open, the painted silk fluttering aggressively. "I must confess, I did not expect to see you and the Duke in London this season. We heard rumors you were entirely occupied with agriculture." The insult was thinly veiled, an accusation that Genevieve was a merchant's daughter playing in the mud, unfit for polite society. Genevieve took another slow sip of her champagne. She looked over the rim of the crystal glass at the widow. She could smell the heavy, cloying lavender perfume radiating off the woman. It was the same scent that had clung to Nathaniel's skin the morning after their wedding. The memory didn't hurt. It just felt tired. "The country air is incredibly restorative," Genevieve said, her voice dropping into a low, conversational hum that forced Camille to lean in to hear. "It allows one to clean out the rot, to prune the dead weight from the estate." Camille's smile tightened into a grimace. "Indeed, though I imagine Nathaniel misses the vibrancy of the city." "Nathaniel is a man of simple tastes, ultimately," Genevieve said, turning her body slightly to face the widow head-on. She lowered her glass. Her eyes locked onto Camille's, entirely devoid of the jealousy or insecurity the widow was clearly hunting for. "He required management, that is all. He was spending entirely too much money on frivolous, depreciating assets. Things that looked pretty, but held no real value. I have restructured his ledgers." Camille's face flushed a deep, ugly red beneath her rouge. She snapped her fan shut with a sharp clack. She opened her mouth, ready to unleash a venomous retort, but Genevieve didn't let her speak. If you will excuse me," Genevieve said, her voice suddenly ringing with the absolute, unquestionable authority of her title. "I need to speak with the Minister of Trade regarding the new railway lines. Enjoy the champagne, madame. I believe Westmore funds paid for the vintage." She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned her back on the widow and walked away, her heavy velvet skirt sweeping imperiously across the polished floor. 2 hours later, the carriage ride back to their rented townhouse was silent. The streets of London were dark, the rain slicking the cobblestones and reflecting the dim glow of the gas lamps. Nathaniel sat opposite her, staring at his gloved hands. He had seen the interaction with Camille. He had seen the widow turn red and flee the ballroom. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly into the darkness of the carriage. Genevieve looked out the window. "Do what?" "Humiliate her. She has nothing to do with us anymore." "I did not humiliate her," Genevieve replied flatly. "I merely reminded her of her place on the ledger. It is a matter of bookkeeping, Nathaniel. Nothing more." Nathaniel swallowed hard. He looked at his wife. She was stunning in the shadows, her profile sharp and pale, the sapphires catching the fleeting light of the street lamps. She was the most formidable creature he had ever known. She had saved his life, salvaged his name, and rebuilt his fortune. And she terrified him. "Are you happy, Genevieve?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Genevieve didn't look at him. She continued staring out the window at the passing stone facades of the city. Was she happy? She felt the rigid boning of her corset pressing against her ribs. She felt the heavy, cold weight of the sapphires against her collarbone. She smelled the damp leather of the carriage and the faint, lingering scent of Nathaniel's clean cologne. She had total control. The estate was thriving. Her father was proud. The ton respected her. The monster in the East End was silenced. She had bought a duke, and she had broken him, molding him into a perfect silent partner in the business of their survival. She had everything she had paid for. "I am solvent," Genevieve answered quietly, the words slipping into the cold air of the carriage. "That is infinitely better than being happy." When they arrived at the townhouse, they walked up the grand staircase together, a picture of aristocratic solidarity for the sleepy footman holding the lamps. At the top of the stairs, Nathaniel paused at the door to his bedchamber. He looked at her, a pathetic, lingering hope in his tired eyes. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the ice would crack. "Good night, Genevieve," he whispered. Genevieve didn't pause. She walked past his door, heading toward the master suite at the end of the hall. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, without turning around. She entered her room and closed the heavy oak door. The click of the lock echoed loudly in the cavernous space. The maids had left a fire burning in the hearth, but the corners of the room remained stubbornly cold. Genevieve stood in the center of the room. She reached behind her neck, unfastening the heavy sapphire clasp. It hit the vanity table with a sharp, heavy clack. She unhooked her dress, letting the midnight velvet pool around her ankles like a collapsed shadow. She climbed into the center of the monstrous four-poster bed. The sheets were pure Egyptian cotton, crisp, white, and freezing against her skin. She lay there in the dark, listening to the silence of the house. There was no carriage crunching on the gravel. There was no betrayal. There was no impending ruin. There was only the vast, quiet empire she had built with her own two hands. She pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin, shivering slightly until her own body heat warmed the space immediately around her. She was perfectly safe. She was incredibly rich. And as she closed her eyes, the sheer, crushing weight of her absolute solitude pressed down upon her, tasting faintly of ash and cold champagne. Did Genevieve's ruthless rise to power leave you breathless? If you couldn't get enough of this dark, deeply human historical drama and a duchess who chose cold steel over a broken heart, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more grounded, intense stories just like this. Be sure to share this video with friends who love complex heroines and absolutely subscribe to the channel so you never miss our weekly uploads. We have more twisting, dramatic storytelling coming your way soon. Sound off in the comments. Was Genevieve's final revenge justified, or did she lose herself in the process? See you in the next one.